Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Outliers YouTube channel and our program, Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction. I'm your host, DP Lyle, and I'm here with my co-host today, Dr. Katherine Ramsland. Katherine, welcome.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks, Doug. And
Good.
I'm going to go ahead and introduce McCracken Poston Jr. And I actually like the Amazon bio of you. So I'm going to say a little bit of that before I talk about how I sort of came into this with you. So McCracken King Poston Jr. was born and raised in Catoosa County in Northwest Georgia, a four-term member of the Georgia House of Representatives. His world unraveled after a number of personal and professional setbacks, including a losing bid for the U.S. Congress. And that's great context for this book. He found himself representing a most unusual client, a man once revered as a natural TV repairman who had also suffered several downfalls, including being accused of holding his wife captive in their basement for almost 3 decades before killing her. The book is ZENITH MAN, Death, Love, and Redemption in a Georgia Courtroom. And the way I came into this was kind of twofold. I already knew this case from, I don't know where, not from the book, it was because it was years ago. And I had used it in my police trainings to make people aware of some of the nuances of psychology in a case. And then I was listening to a podcast called Noble about the tri-state crematory scandal. And on one of the episodes was McCracken Poston Jr. talking and sounding for all the world like Shelby Foote, very natural storyteller. So I call him the Shelby Foote of defense attorneys. And listening to him on that podcast made me really want to read the book. Once I read the book, it was just, I found it to be so amazing. And then he told me the story of how it came to be written the way it was written, rather than simply a true crime kind of book. It was written as his story, very much as the story of the defendant, his client. So I would love for you to tell that story because I just found that so engaging.
Well, first, let me introduce everybody to Alvin and Virginia, the mystery couple. They grace the cover of this book. That is from a photo booth from a little amusement park in Catoosa County that's still open. It's almost 100 years old. It's called Lake Winnipesaukee. And it's Alvin was a TV repairman, and he had the franchise for the Zenith dealership. Now, a lot of people on the younger end don't have any idea of how big televisions used to be. They were huge and they were deep. There were no flat screens. You needed a lot of depth for the picture tube assembly. And they were built in very often in heavy wooden cabinetry, which meant once that thing was delivered to your house and it goes on the blink, you're not going to throw it in the car and take it somewhere. That repair person is going to come to you. And that's what Alvin Ridley did. Before that, he was in my sister's class at Ringgold High School. And I was the last born in our family. And so I really didn't know him at all until he actually was our TV repairman. And Alvin was, you know, eccentric was the kindest word anybody could say about him. Um, he uh, he was to the typical person, he seemed unusual, somewhat obsessive about a few things. And as the years went on, and I think a lot of people accommodated Alvin in his youth and even in the early part of his marriage. But then things changed. We had a lot of new people come into the county. The county's grown, just explosively grown. And I think that things change, and everybody's view of Alvin changed. The mystery about Virginia was Alvin and Virginia got married in 1966 in Ringgold, Georgia, 3 weeks after Dolly Parton came from Nashville with her fiance Carl Dean and got married. And that was 1966. But by 1969, when George Jones and Tammy Wynette came to Ringgold, Georgia to get married, Virginia was missing. And a article in the local county newspaper put in by her parents kind of was one bookend of her disappearance. The other bookend, unfortunately, was while I was representing Alvin, a national tabloid with the headline, "Sicko Holds Wife Hostage 30 Years, Then Kills Her." And within those bookends, there was very little known about Virginia or where she had been or what she had been doing or why she had been missing or why she didn't talk to her family. So it was a real mystery. But when Alvin made the phone call first to a Chattanooga hospital asking for them to come get his wife because he didn't trust anybody locally. And the Chattanooga hospital said, no, you have to dial 911. And so, somewhat reluctantly, he did. And that's when the investigation began. But it was several months before they charged Alvin. But he was talking to me within days, kind of stalking me on the street, as I determined. So he seemed very interested in talking to me, but not about his wife. He wanted to talk about ancient civil litigation that he had waged back in the 1980s with a counterclaim or countersuit causing his 1977 Chevy van to be picked up to pay what they thought was a judgment from one of the defendants that Alvin had sued, a counterclaim. Well, Alvin was obsessed about that van. That's all he wanted to talk about. And it was a long time with no charges, so we just kind of agreed that, look, I'm not sure if anything's going to happen with this, so why don't we just go on our separate ways? But you know how to reach me, and if I hear you are arrested or anything, I'll find you. And that's what happened at the end of June 1998 when Alvin was picked up, pulled over, and arrested. A special presentment grand jury had accused him of Virginia's murder. So now we had to get down to business. But I had now a client that uncooperative would be an understatement. He only wanted to talk about the ancient civil litigation that resulted in his van being taken. Well, I ultimately had to realize that this man is suffering under some delusion that taking of that van in 1984 has something to do with his wife's death. And when I presented that to him, he said, well, it also killed my mother and father too, because they worried them to death. So he kept pushing me to go and study the civil litigation. Well, now we had a murder trial, so I was resistant. But ultimately, I realized that he wasn't going to do anything until I satisfied that and went over and looked through those files. Well, interestingly, while kind of doing a general scan of the Catoosa County civil court files, I found another case, the Ringgold Housing Authority versus Alvin Ridley. And this was 1970. So pretty much 2 years into Virginia's disappearance, here's an eviction. I open up the file, there's a jury list. He had a jury trial on an eviction. And Georgia law, used to be where you could have a jury trial on just about anything. Well, Alvin took advantage of that and had a jury trial. Well, I see a jury list and I know some of the names on there, and one of them is still alive from 27 years. And I had recently represented her son. So I called Mary Hakes and I said, Mary, you won't believe where I found your name in this old file about an eviction, and there was a trial. And she said, I remember it like it was yesterday. And I said, what do you mean? She said, that man made a circus of the court. And the court finally just stopped it and said, Mr. Ridley, let's get down to business. Send for your wife. Virginia's parents were sitting in that courtroom. This eviction was probably caused by her parents and the allegation that Virginia was being held. The housing authority was claiming that the couple was not staying in the house, so therefore they violated their contract. Well, Alvin's father went to get Virginia. She came into the courtroom. She stood in front of the bench and told the court that when she married, she and her husband became one. And she wished everybody would leave them alone. She wanted to be with her husband. Just to be sure, the judge had her go back into chambers with her parents. He allowed Alvin's father to go back with them all, including the judge, but he wouldn't let Alvin go. And so whatever Virginia said in there, nobody's alive today that can testify to it. But her parents pretty much left her alone after that point. That was 1970. So the rumors they had stirred up between 1968 and 1970 with the little article that she was missing, that set into place when her father had passed and her mother had gone to a nursing home. When Virginia died, it fell upon her siblings, and they picked up on that mantra that Alvin had been keeping her captive. And so that's what lured the national tabloids, which love a story like that. Interestingly, Alvin was not charged with falsely imprisoning Virginia, but it was the DA tried to use it as what we used to call in Georgia similar transactions evidence. In other words, if they show other bad actions, the jury can infer, well, if he did that, he probably killed her, and those type of things. So we had a battle on our hands, even with a murder and aggravated assault and malice murder and felony murder charges. So the die was cast, and I had a client who only wanted to talk about the county taking his van. Well, I eventually got to that file in my civil records search, and I realized that the sheriff tried to return the van 3 weeks later. Alvin challenged the taking of it, saying, well, there is no judgment yet. And he got it reversed, and they tried to deliver the van, but in Alvin's somewhat Rube Goldberg diagram mind of causation, Alvin thought, well, if I touch this van, that means I accept it, which means it's going to start a new statute of limitations where I can't sue them more. And so he thought by not touching it, that preserved a statute of limitations. Well, at the time of the representation, that van had sat untouched for 15 years. Last July, we reached 40 years and still untouched. So he was a difficult client.
And there's overarching all this is your tenacity and compassion and the way you hang in there despite his not just resistance, yelling at you, not letting you in his house, I see that, to me, our listeners will certainly be interested in that kind of story over the story. Was
Well, when they
your
read it,
involvement.
when they read it, they'll know it's not altruism. I had a number of things going on, including I had just been greatly defeated in a race for the United States Congress. It was insulting, the level of my loss. And I had just spent 4 terms in the Georgia legislature, after having gone through a bit of uh, a transition of embracing good government. I passed Georgia's first ethics bill, which made lobbyists register and report what they gave to us, which made me extremely unpopular among my colleagues. But it was a very popular bill outside of the Capitol, and supported by the newspapers and the citizens. And so I thought, well, I've done everything right. But what I didn't anticipate was the big red tide that was washing up into North Georgia and flooded and has never ebbed. And that was the transition of Georgia from an old Southern Democratic state to a GOP state. And I was the first Democrat, I think, since the Civil War to lose that congressional district. And now, how was there an incumbent in place? Well, he switched. It was a Democrat who switched parties after his second election. And so, what was, you ask what my motivation, why I kept at it. For one, my dad liked Alvin. And I didn't anticipate putting so much about my dad in this book, but I practiced what they call the vomit draft. I wrote a proposal that stuck very close to Alvin and the trial, Alvin and his lawyer. And then when I did the vomit draft approach, I was asking one of my sisters, do you remember when I took Alvin by to see our parents? Because my parents had a very calming effect on Alvin. They weren't judgmental of him. We were far enough out of Ringgold in the little town of Graysville where they lived that they didn't have baked in the local prejudices and biases about Alvin, who shuttered his business in the middle of town and it was falling in on itself. And so they didn't think poorly of him. And my dad even had this weird bartering thing where he was like sharpening Alvin's lawnmower blades or something like that, that he did portrayed. So my sister said, "Well, I've got Mama's journals." Well, none of us want to read Mama's journals. My mother wrote raw. She wrote about all our divorces and all of our, you know, she just wrote. That was her therapy. She wrote, and none of her 6 children want to read them, but we don't want to get rid of them. So I said, well, let me take 1 year of her journals. And I took them, and it really opened my eyes and it opened my memory. I had completely forgotten and repressed a lifetime of having an alcoholic father. And he was a wonderful father. I hate the shortcut that alcoholic Southern men are treated in literature and movies, wearing the wife beater and being completely cruel and drunk. My dad was nothing like that. He was a sweet, loving man, but he had a horrible problem with alcohol. And when you're a child, the only way you interpret that is toward yourself. You look inward and you think, well, why does he feel the need to do that when it's his and my day to go do stuff? And believe me, I have had some white knuckle rides in the old truck, you know, hanging on and hoping we would make it home. And it was just suppressed, just out of, I guess, a defense mechanism. But then when I saw it, I realized that in the middle of trying to start helping Alvin, we did our first intervention with our father and we put him in the hospital. And then I remembered, well, I talked to my dad. I never told anybody who I was advising informally because I felt it was attorney-client privilege. But I knew my dad liked Alvin, and we all knew Alvin's wife, mysterious wife, had been found and had died. And after my dad sobered up in the hospital, I told him that I was talking with Alvin, meeting with Alvin. And my dad said something I'll never forget. He said, "You know, son, he's a good man. He just thinks differently." And and I so a lot of my motivation, doctor, to finally get around to answering your question was that I think that you will have a lifetime with a loving alcoholic parent in doing just about anything to please them.
Mm-hmm.
And also, at a fairly critical stage of the case when I was really thinking about walking away because Alvin was so difficult, the congressman called. And he called my office. And the guy that had just beat me just less than 2 years before. And Alvin kind of sat up straight, like I thought, God, he thinks this is about him. You know, and I thought, well, okay, Alvin is saying, ain't you going to call the congressman back? And I said, "Oh, sure, I'll call him back." And I did call him back. Well, the congressman said, "Keep Alvin Ridley away from my congressional offices." He was ordering me to keep the man that was just across the table from me away from his congressional office. He said he scares the ladies there. Well, I I had to think fast because I knew that my hold on Alvin in terms of trust was tenuous. So I came up with this construct that the phone call was about the congressman was going to have us both arrested if either one of us went to his office. And I was saying, you know, Alvin, he doesn't like me, you know, the election. And Alvin looked at me because he knew I'd been routed. So I don't know if that sold him on that or not. But just as an added touch, I said, Alvin, if you will just cooperate and don't go to his office and you just help me help you, talk about the murder case. When this is all over with, I'll take you to his house and show you where he lives. And that satisfied him. That satisfied Alvin.
That is great in a
because
diabolical way.
because I wasn't being like everybody else and saying no. I was just saying wait. Let's be smart on our timing of when you pop in on the congressman at home. Of course, I had no
And you did
intentions
that
of doing
a
that.
number of times. You'd find constructs through which to present material or get him to do something that would make sense to him and be acceptable to him. And I thought that was very creative on your part.
Well, I had this motivation to get to the finish line. And it was really funny because the whole plan was that Alvin was never going to testify. And that plan was because invariably he would come back to the van. Now, of course, I think it's probably time to reveal something that I didn't know at the time of representing Alvin. But 22 years later, at the suggestion of a juror from the case who was still interested in the case over 2 decades later, she asked me, "Do you think Alvin has autism?" Well, I didn't know anything about autism in the late 1990s. And I don't think there was a lot of talk about autism in adults then. But since then, I have been practicing law and I've been encountering younger persons who were on the spectrum who had grown up, and we had our national uh, glossary now included autism more, and our national experiences included uh, getting to know people with autism. So the minute she said the words, I thought, that makes all the sense in the world. So I talked to Alvin, and by the way, Alvin and I maintained a friendship for 25 years after the trial, and on and off. But at one point, I took him to lunch, and I just kind of casually said, we should do this more often. Well, he was at my office the very next week on the same day, ready to go. And we had a very strict schedule for many, many years. And the last 5 years after his diagnosis, and right as I was really starting in earnest to write the book, I wanted to be around him more. That was the far cry from how it was in the late 1990s when I didn't want to be around him at all. But Alvin had a a kindness to him that was not revealed, or it was hidden. It was hidden by all our prejudices and biases. Um, but Alvin, I took him to Atlanta for testing. Um, and the happiest I am about this book has been the reaction of people on the spectrum who have read it, but especially the reaction of the families and loved ones and parents and teachers and doctors of neurodivergent folks. And they have chided me. They say, I saw it on page one. Well, of course I didn't see it, but I'm reporting it from my position of ignorance. Like I was pulling my hair out. What is going on with this guy?
But that's what makes it such a story. It's a story of discovery for you as well.
Absolutely. But when that diagnosis came through, I knew I could write this book. The poet Maya Angelou has a quote that when I first saw it, I thought, I know how this woman feels when she wrote this. The quote was, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. And that's the way I felt. And I had been giving this story away for years, and Alvin had too. Anytime anybody would want to talk about it, we would go talk to them. People Magazine, the Washington Post, NPR's Snap Judgment, Forensic Files, American Justice. People are familiar with this story already, but these were all pre-discovery of Alvin's autism. And that unlocked everything to me. And so I'm very pleased, and I hope any of your listeners who one woman who I know has an autistic son, she was quoted in a local newspaper about the book, and she said the book gave her hope. And I thought, well, how does it give her hope? And I later talked to her about it, and she said, because Alvin ran a business and had a long, happy marriage. And I thought, those are another two things that Alvin pulled off better than I did in life. and, and so I started realizing, along the way that I was not a better person in the eyes of God than Alvin. And the way both my parents raised us all was that there is no better person than another person. That'll get you in trouble when you're like dealing with celebrities because you feel like you can just go right up and talk to them or whatever. And because you think at the same time, they're no better than anybody either. But Alvin was a challenge from day one. There was another factor, a friend, probably the only identifiable friend that I could find of Alvin's, was a guy named Salesman Sam. That wasn't his real name, but that was the town name for him. He rode around on a bicycle selling things out of catalogs in the basket of his bicycle. But apparently, he had been Alvin's legal advisor for decades, and he did not step aside for me. So I was constantly dealing with really bad advice that Salesman Sam was giving Alvin, ultimately leading him to getting detained at a federal courthouse when he was supposed to be by my side in a courtroom previewing jurors. So it was just a wild ordeal and a wild ride. But as I was reading the transcript, because everything said from the stand in the book is from transcript. And it is some of the funniest part of the story. What people are saying under oath and how they're responding
Yeah.
to questioning.
And part of it is framed through your perspective, because like you're resisting certain things that end up being the best thing that could have happened.
Absolutely. But I began to realize while I was reading it, for example, Alvin had this terrible thing about jamming his hand into his pocket, which sounded like it had $27 of coins in it. And he would just shake it to the point where I couldn't hear. The jurors were looking at him. I would just grab his hand, or he would start writing really loudly on the table. And I found my notes from the trial, and it's my notes to him. Don't write hard, and but these things.
And don't forget the cockroaches.
We'll get to that in a minute. But these things are like they call stimming. A person with autism could be, doing some repetitive movement. It's called stimming, and then the talk of the van. That's something that's called looping. They'll loop back to something that they just are somewhat obsessed over. And then, we had our meltdowns, usually in my office, usually Alvin and I screaming at each other because I just couldn't believe it. And at some point early in the representation, he mentioned the van in one of his screams, and I just said, "Oh, Lord, the van." Alvin went silent. He thought I was praying. And I looked at him, and he had the classic child's prayer, his hands clasped and his eyes closed. And I thought, I can work with this. And so I just finished that meeting with a long, long prayer. And we prayed every time we were together after that, but it was me just disguising legal advice in the form of a prayer. It was not moving Alvin any closer because he would end with, "I'll think about it." Especially my request, which I thought was not unusual. He let every cop in his house that ever wanted to go there, but he wouldn't let me. And I don't know why, but for 14 months, I was denied access to his house. And I would explain to him, this is why, this is why. And on Thanksgiving of 1998, well, one thing happened before then that finally gave me something. For one, the state gave me 45 new witnesses. And it was a gift because I told the judge there's no way I can go through this by the time of trial. So we got a bit of a continuance from the September calendar. Well, it was in September that tragically the Olympic track star Florence Griffith Joyner passed away. Nobody knew why. She was always dogged by kind of a jealous accusations of performance enhancing drugs. There was a call for an extensive autopsy, I think, with that in mind. But in October, I had a big party to celebrate the fact that I wasn't having to go to trial with Alvin. And I'm cleaning up after the party, and on CNN, they mentioned that the autopsy was done with the Olympic great Florence Griffith Joyner, or FloJo, as everybody called her, and that she had died of a seizure. Well, Alvin had been telling me all along that Virginia had epilepsy. Epileptic is how he said it. She was epileptic, and that she had had a spell. And so that was our defense. And so I had been needing to find, because the state of Georgia's autopsy said, well, she has these markings and there are way too much of them to be a seizure. So she was manually asphyxiated. Well, we got Florence Griffith Joyner's autopsy, which in my view was the world's best autopsy, done in a very reputable lab in Orange County, California, by, you know, almost famous doctors, because they dealt with celebrities very often. And she had a lot more petechial hemorrhages than Virginia did. And they said that's a seizure death. So if by Georgia standards, FloJo was brutally murdered, and that's not the case. And what I loved about, for her family and for her legacy, there was nothing stronger than Tylenol and Benadryl in her system, and far back as they looked. And so it was so tragic, but that Olympic track star helped save a man. And so the next break was Thanksgiving, when my parents and my father, still struggling, but kind of getting on top of sobriety. I was proud, but I didn't believe he could pull it off, quite frankly. Um, but they sent me home with an extra turkey plate, and they said, "We want you to take it to Alvin." And that's the last place I wanted to go on my day off on Thanksgiving. But I went, and I knocked on the door, and I always kind of stood back to the side after I knocked on the door, because I knew Alvin had a shotgun, and I knew he was worried about people being after him all the time. Well, he came to the door and he opened it up, and I said, "Alvin, my parents wanted you to have this turkey plate for Thanksgiving." I did find that Alvin is very transactional, that representing him was almost like a business transaction, where I would, I would barter for things. I would barter for, I never got access to the house up to that point. But there I was with a turkey plate. I wasn't wanting to stay. I just wanted to hand him the bag and leave. But he said, "Just a minute." And he went in the house, and I could hear him turn the TV off. Thought I heard him talking to somebody. He came out, opened the door, and said, "Come on in." So it was a gift. It was a gift because I brought him a gift. And inside that house, I found the most incredible treasure trove of Virginia's writings. And I didn't know how to interpret them. They had been, there were 15 to 20,000, I estimate. I spent the next 4 days going through them and trying to compile ones that I thought would be relevant in our case. But all the while, Alvin is saying, "Well, you can't have them. That's all I've got left of her." So our ultimate compromise was that he would keep control of the originals. He would bring them to my office, so I would copy the ones we wanted to use, because I had to give copies to the DA. And I guess to an outside observer, they would just look like ramblings. But there was something from just about every month of the 30 years she was supposed to have been held captive. She wrote a proposed script for the Unsolved Mysteries TV series. The proposed script that she wanted Unsolved Mysteries to, the pitch that she wanted Unsolved Mysteries to cover on their program, was the taking of Alvin's van after his father's car accident and all the litigation.
Of course it was.
And I found glossaries where she had been somehow studying legal terms and writing them down. And I think she was the mastermind behind all the litigation. And she had a very different hand than Alvin did. She had a very stylistic way she did the lower descender letters, like the Y's and things that hang off in cursive, things that hang below the baseline. And but I didn't have any known handwriting. For a handwriting analyst has to look at a known writing, meaning one that's done in an official capacity, maybe with witnesses, and that's they can at least base from that their examination of the others. But then I remembered they did get married, and luckily her maiden name was Hickey, which had the same Y, very stylistic Y that was on Ridley. And so it was just fascinating. I had gotten an epilepsy expert to talk about the petechia and talk about those hemorrhages being quite common in seizures, even among his living patients. And as just a last minute before I put him on the stand, dinner out, he asked me a question that just blew everything open. He said, "Is there anything else unusual about this woman?" And I said, "Yeah, she couldn't, I don't remember what joke I said, but it was almost like she couldn't burp without writing it down." And he said, "Oh, that's hypergraphia. I have it in some of my temporal lobe patients, epilepsy patients." And I was blown away. Now I could explain why she wrote so much. And it didn't affect what she wrote. It didn't cause any mental delusion or defect. It just compelled her to write it. So in those 30 years, there was discussion of the moon landings, big, huge events that were on national TV, as well as poems and songs. And throughout it all, she loved Alvin, you could tell. And you could tell by her reports that he loved her. But they were two against the world. They really felt like everybody was out to get them. One of her last entries was something about how much she loved Alvin, but the city messed up their water line. So, it, you know, obviously I, I had a lot riding on it. And then in the middle of the trial, my dad shows up and I thought, oh God, I can't handle this. But he was sober. And it was the first thing in my memory that my dad ever attended sober. And that goes all the way back my entire life. And so when I was trying to figure out how to illustrate this book, for one thing, publishers know what they're doing, because I had a folk art piece by the Reverend Howard Finster. If anybody listens to you loves folk art, Howard Finster was from here, and he was a friend. And he loved this story, and he met Alvin once, and he just loved the story. And he did a painting of Alvin wearing his characteristic neck brace, which was unnecessary, but Alvin felt it was necessary. It was almost like a pacifier. And it was so bad that when Alvin forgot it on the first day of trial, he threatened to bolt, which he was good at bolting from courtrooms. And so I sent my secretary quickly to go buy a new one. And as the jurors are walking into the courtroom, here's a lawyer putting a soft neck brace on his client. It looked like a car accident case, you know, kind of sleazy lawyer. So, so I'm I'm just so, I was just so happy that things were going well. But then again, I never planned on putting Alvin on the stand. And then Jesus appeared to him during lunch. The one day I don't sit with him, I let some of Salesman Sam and some of his hangers on sit with him. And he tells me that Jesus ordered him to take the stand. And I knew that that was Alvin's call. Whether he testified or not testified, only he could make that decision. But I really wanted him to think about it. So I took him in. And by the way, when he brought the suitcases, old suitcases full of Virginia's writings into the courtroom every day, he released scores of cockroaches into the courtroom. And after about 3 days of that, the judge ordered us to move into the adjacent courthouse to the large old courtroom. And I realized walking in that we were returning Virginia's writings to the last place she had ever been seen in public, September 15, 1970. And it was an adrenaline boost for me. It was eerie, but I could stand in front of the jury and say, she stood right here and said, I want to be with my husband. And it was very empowering. And so, but here we are now. Alvin said Jesus told him that he had to take the stand. And so I was just trying to quickly prep him. We went back into the fumigated roach courtroom, and I put him on the stand to see, look, it's a different perspective. You'll be looking out at everybody, including the jurors. It's not like with your backs to most everybody, with your back to most everybody. And Alvin was amazing on the stand because I let him tell his whole story. I let him tell about the taking of the van. I let him take the things that I just detested for him raising. I let him talk about it, and it kept him on point. And he was doing so well. I forgot how he was, and I said a couple of times, "Well, Alvin, you know, a lot of this litigation you started with lawyers, but then you would fire them or they would leave you." And matter of fact, I was kind of patting myself on the back. I'm the first lawyer that's ever stayed with you from the beginning of a matter through the end. And his answer was in perfect timing so far. So meaning I could get canned any minute. And the jurors were having a similar reaction that you're having. And I thought, this is not bad. We're in a murder trial and we've got them kind of giggling over there. But I would forget and I would say, Alvin, you know, tell the jurors, you know, what you've lost. And I wanted him to say, the love of my life, my only friend in the world. But because Alvin, I didn't know he was autistic, he's interpreting that as something that needs a literal question, that needs a literal answer. And he says, oh, I guess the funeral bill. So, you know, I could see the DA scribbling away that answer. And of course, he, you know, characterized Alvin as a cold, dispatched killer. That's all he was worried about was money and losing that funeral bill. Which, interestingly enough, it came out in the trial that he borrowed the money for the funeral. So it was quite an ordeal, and then followed by 25 years of, you know, I guess 22 years of just trying to be there for Alvin when he would have another blow up of some type. But then when we learned about the autism, my secretary and I, we stayed even closer. We just felt the need to protect him and to help him interpret the world. But in reality, again, Alvin was a lot more successful than I was on many fronts. At some point, it came out in the trial that he had successfully appealed a matter to the Court of Appeals, Well, I thought, well, hell, I haven't done that yet. So in many ways, professionally, he was doing better than me. But not giving away the whole book, because I think your readers and viewers will love to hear about Kitty and Meowie,
I was going to mention them.
Alvin's
I love
cats.
them.
I don't want
Yes.
to go into it, but they became the focus in one aspect of the
Yeah.
trial, had the DA had his druthers. But we kind of headed them off at the pass with a late veterinary visit that was quite revealing, actually.
Just that moment when he gives you a cat finally and says, "This is Meowie." And I thought that can't be his name.
Well, I accused Alvin of, well, I told him because he never called them by name. I'd seen them in the house. But I knew now the DA was raising them as an issue. And so, I said, we got to get those cats to the vet. And of course, the last day I could add a witness, Alvin comes in and says, why ain't we getting the cats to the vet? And I thought, gee. So I just, on walking with him toward the house, I had one of my staffers making these banker boxes, and we had like a bungee cord and a roll of tape. We were trying to get them in boxes. I said, Alvin, before these cats get to the vet, they better have names. And I'm not sure if he named them right then
That's what I
or
thought.
or you know, but they had names by the time we got to the vet, so he came through. Kitty and Meowie, which is a very literal name for a cat when you think
And
about it.
it was a glorious moment when it came out. Like, this is perfect. It's
Yeah. So by now, your listeners and viewers are thinking, this is a true crime book.
well,
It
that's
is
the wonderful part of it is it is true crime, but it's got this other story going on, and our listeners especially understand the role of conflict, and there's conflict all the way through
Right.
this book.
Yeah.
There's tension, there's suspense, that's not even about the trial. It's about your relationship and your tenacity with this.
And it's all true.
Yeah.
I have to live in this town, and everything from the stand remained exactly as it was said. Uh, it was easy to recreate my conversations with Alvin because they were the same conversation every time. It ended up in, this is all because they took my van, and and then I thought,
But even your expert witnesses that you say you went to dinner, but those were scenes. Those were
yeah,
moments
yeah.
in
No, we did
themselves.
go. We did
Yeah.
go to dinner, and if Alvin, with the unfortunate uh, choice I made of a forensic pathologist who turned out to be a disaster. But Alvin was so excited. That was an expert that he understood. And I didn't anticipate that Alvin was going to open up his doors for that man and have some props in there as well. And it was just poignant in a way, but at the same time, I didn't know if I was going to get out alive because my expert was armed and afraid of Alvin. And then Alvin realized that he's armed, so Alvin pulls out a gun, and I'm the only unarmed guy in the room. And it was very, very short visit, but Alvin was just being very, for the first time, engaged in his defense. For the first time, he was engaged in the fight. And, Alvin felt that the U.S. Constitution had a provision in it that said you don't have to go to court if you're not feeling well. And I had been messing around in politics for the first decade of my being a lawyer. I had to go look at the Constitution and make sure it didn't say that. And then I started carrying around a paper copy of the Constitution that I would throw at Alvin every time he raised it. And I would say, find the provision, I will file the motion. And of course, he would flip around and, we'd move on to the next subject. So it was just a way to shut him down pretty quickly.
And then you had a hard time finding a publisher who wanted the Alvin story. It was something, I mean, it was you actually bringing your story into it that made the difference.
Well, they gave me the contract based on just the Alvin story. But as I was going through my mother's year of mother's journal and found all the stuff about my father, and I realized what all had motivated me, and it was another conflict that I was having to deal with at the time. And so I was in what they call the vomit draft, where you just throw everything on that first draft. I just threw it all in. I threw in the intervention, the conversation I had with my dad about Alvin, and the stress of worrying about my dad. Now, when I was going to illustrate the book, the two big newspapers in Chattanooga merged on January 1st of 1999. And so I didn't realize that I was looking in the old newspapers archives for photos. I thought maybe there's a photo from the trial. And I found in the Chattanooga Hamilton County Library 247 negatives from the trial.
Wow.
And so they let me use a loop and a light board, and I'm going through and I'm going through and I'm thinking these are incredible and they're in the book. But I was taken aback by an image that I had never seen before. And there were a total of 3 images of my father hugging Alvin and whispering something in his ear that Alvin could not remember, because my father passed in 2009, 10 years after this trial. And he had mostly sober 10 years. So it was a real victory for him to have come to that trial sober and to come the last 3 days of it. And it was a huge victory for me. But that said it all, that photo. And so I was proud. I think I might have used 2 of them. I don't know. In my contract, there's so many rookie lessons. If you want to do a separate one just on avoiding rookie mistakes, I'm your guy, because I've made them. But I saw in my contract 16 pages of photos. I had to do an art log with 16 pages of photos. Well, in my naivete, I thought a page was a piece of paper. And so I'm thinking, 16 pages, that's 32 sides. I called them sides. And so I gave them 32 sides of photos. And my publisher said, no, 16 pages means 8 pieces of paper, 16 sides, because they're numbered, the pages, one, and I thought, of course. But she said, I'll do this on the ebook edition. You can have all 32 pages. So that has, and in color, a lot of more color in that. So with the limitations of print, I'm very honored and happy to have been published by a traditional publisher, distributed by Penguin Random House. But I'm mostly happy that this story came out in time for Alvin to be not only appreciated and better understood, but he was a superstar. He became the most popular celebrity in our little town for the last 4 months of his life. And he had a lightness about him, and just his bearing changed. And he was still very sweet and kind to people, but now people were being sweet and kind to him. And again, very transactional. Alvin liked you if you liked him. And he found out a lot of people liked him. And and I think it was sincere. I think, everybody is redeemed in this book. Even my former congressional opponent, he actually gets redeemed at the end. And those were true redemption. That the people who were trying him, the ones that were from Ringgold, they went on to other positions in the community. And Alvin supported them. And when he started voting again, he voted for them. And but right before the book came out, people were clamoring for his endorsement. So it was just a wonderful way for him
It's,
to end
yeah.
for his life to end. Now, we had been monitoring since I'd been taking Alvin to the VA for, gosh, I got him started with VA medicine while I was representing him. And then we started taking him, especially when the clinic moved. It was a little harder part of Chattanooga to get to. So we would just take him, either my secretary or myself, if I couldn't go. And so we were helping Alvin interpret, and this is before we knew about the autism too, but we were just helping Alvin understand what the doctor was saying. Kidney function was a concern for several years. And about in May of last year, Alvin's kidney function plummeted, uh, and he looked very bad. And I took him to the doctor. And the best illustration of what this book meant to Alvin was revealed to me when the doctor brought up the book. And Alvin said, "Doctor, we went to Jimmy Carter's place." Well, that was the presidential library where the book was launched. And he said, "I spoke to 300,000 people." And the doctor looked at me and I said, "Take 3 zeros off the end of that, and you're close." But Alvin said, "They put their hands together for me." And he's tearing up when he's saying this. And he said, "And they smiled at me and they liked me," all those people.
Wow.
And Alvin never went home after that doctor's visit. We put him right in the hospital. He went and stayed at hospitals and stepped down places. And in July, late June, we were getting him ready for a prostate ablation. Some of his kidney problems were obstructed pathway. So he was getting ready for that. And I get a call about 2:30 in the morning from a doctor who said, "Your friend is having a moderate heart attack. I need to know right now if we go in to treat this heart, it's going to kill his kidneys off and he'll go straight to on dialysis." And I said, "Well, I can't make this call. I don't know what Alvin signed, but I am not going to make this call without him." So I, got up and went to the hospital about 2:45. And Alvin's sitting up in the bed with a blazer on over his hospital garb, and he's handing out these book cards to the third shift nurses that he hadn't met yet. And I said, "You don't look like a guy that's having a heart attack." And they said, "Oh, we got him on morphine now." So so I thought, okay. And I just thought this is an opportunity. I said, "Alvin, if you ever think that Virginia and your mother and your father are trying to call you home?" And without missing a beat, he said, "No, they want me to stay here with you." So a couple of days later, I decide it's the July 2nd, it's the week of the 4th, everything's dead around the office. And I thought, I'm just going to go visit Alvin. And I went took my time. I went to a gift shop. I got a little stuffed gorilla that reminded me of one that used to be in the front of his business when I was growing up. And it was all sun faded. The looks of the things in the windows of his business also led to his kind of reputation because they just looked like the island of misfit toys uh, in his front glass. It didn't look like a shuttered TV shop. It looked like a kind of a flea market. But I got him this little stuffed animal, and I went in and I could tell he was in discomfort again. And so I told them, and they gave him some morphine, and they're kind of tending to him while I'm talking to him. And as I did many times during the representation, I would find another angle. And I would try something with Alvin, he'd shut me down. I would come at it from a different direction. And I think I was just on autopilot doing this. I don't think I had any motive like I did 25 years ago to try to get him to cooperate. But I just said, Alvin, I want to tell you, I'm looking forward to meeting Virginia because I feel like I know her. Well, by me positioning it this way, now I'm in heaven. And so now he's a lot more comfortable talking about it. And he says, when we're up there, my daddy will take us fishing. They've got a river where you can catch 30 fish an hour. And I thought, classic Alvin story. It ends with a number. It ends with some kind of rule or regulation that nobody can disprove. That there's a catch limit in heaven, by the way, of 30 fish an hour. But it just was, he was having a pleasant thought about his afterlife. A couple of years ago, he came to me and he was grumbling that a cousin was calling him, and he said, I think she's just wanting me to die. And I thought, that's interesting. And I said, Alvin, you realize you don't have to leave your things to anybody. You can leave it to a cause. And I told him about some things he could do. And he went to another lawyer and he made a will for his entire estate to go to establish a fund for children on the spectrum to go get further their education.
That's great.
So
Wow.
we're in the process of trying to get that set up and get the estate set up, and hopefully it's going to provide. And you know, I think that we may limit it to trade schools, maybe maybe people interested in electronics and computers and things like that that interested Alvin. And he'll have a legacy. He'll have a legacy with that scholarship, and so his name will live on. And
That's great.
hopefully the book will live on. I mean, I've always known this was an evergreen story. It's just kind of a timeless thing about misunderstandings, and these misunderstandings are still taking place. There's 5 million undiagnosed adults with autism in this country, and they're having those same interactions with police and lawyers and judges. And I flubbed Alvin, for much of the representation. I completely misread him, didn't understand him, thought he was being evasive, and it's the very same thing the detectives thought. And I feel terrible about it. I got to apologize to him after his autism diagnosis. And after his diagnosis, he was just a lighter person. He seemed to understand there's a reason why people have trouble with me. And he seemed to be okay with it. And I loved that about him.
Well, McCracken, that's a great ending to this thing. This has been fantastic.
Yeah.
And as another Southern boy, I can tell, I know the answer to this, but you grew up telling stories from the time you were a kid because you are a great storyteller. And those of us from down there, I always say they won't feed you if you can't tell a story in the South. And that's pretty much true. But I have to ask you, do you have any other books planned? What's for you down the road?
Good question.
I mean, I know this was extremely, extremely personal and over a long, long period of time. And like you said, as Maya Angelou said, it's a story that had to get out.
It had to get out.
Do you have any other stories? I mean, or even stories that you want to tell that aren't maybe this personal or not, whatever. Do you have anything else you want to do down the road like that?
I've got a lot of stories I'd like to tell.
Okay.
There may be, it may be, and I one of my favorite writers. Oh Lord, now I'm getting online and not being able to pull up his name. But
we all do that.
South Carolina, lived in South Carolina, went to the Citadel. Help me here.
Conroy?
Pat Conroy.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of his fiction was thinly disguised facts.
Exactly.
And I like that notion. I like the freedom that fiction would give you.
Yes.
Because I think sticking to the facts were important to me in this story. And I think because I have to live in this town, and I didn't want to disparage anybody, because really, again, everybody is redeemed at the end of this book, redeemed by Alvin, if not by Jesus. And and so.
But you're absolutely correct. Take a true story and make it a fictional story. And that way you have a lot more freedom. And I'm going to tell you, it's a lot of fun. So many fiction writers base their stories on maybe a little incident or maybe a big story or a small story, but something they've run across and they say, huh, what if? And then the story starts.
Yeah.
Do it. You are a good writer. You are a wonderful storyteller. And people like you are worth their weight in gold, and we want to see more from you. I'm going to tell you.
Don't forget Brent Marsh. I want that story.
Well, and you know, and I have to respect my clients too.
Yeah.
And so yeah, and I've tried to get my head around the story there with Tri-State. And I think there is a story there, even if I didn't discuss him much or go into attorney-client privilege. For one thing, his mother was a deeply religious woman who had a strong faith. And I know she's originally from South Carolina, and I would love to know the root of her faith, because it was incredible in times where just things were falling apart all around them. That we would just suddenly get this break that was really helpful. I want your folks to know that, again, there's more than one book called Zenith Man out there.
Oh, right. Yeah.
The other one is a fictionalized account of our story.
This is it right here. So
that's the one. That's not the fiction. That's the
real one.
Yeah, make sure it's with your name.
Yeah, it has your name on it. And
but I would love for people to review it and let me know what they think.
Yes.
And you know, I was very honored. Before 10 months, we had over 1,000 Amazon ratings, and so we're very excited. I say we. I used to say we, me, and Alvin, and now I guess I should just say I am very excited. But I think it's a story that everybody that grew up in a town that had the oddball, the slightly scary character, the
Boo Radley,
if you will.
Exactly.
And a woman from Monroeville, Alabama called me. She had read the book. She loved it. And she said, do you know that Boo Radley was a real person? That not by that name, but someone that Harper Lee had encountered.
Right.
Well, I thought, well, every town.
Yeah.
Over my life, I can name a dozen nicknames of people, not always kind nicknames, of people who just presented. And aren't we in a much better place now that people are being diagnosed and given access to services and taught how to navigate a neurotypical world much easier.
And a lot of them become novelists.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, some of our greatest contributors have been neurodivergent. And so, you know, I'm just very honored to have been here and to have been invited and to be able to talk to both of you, even though I didn't let you get a word in edgeways.
No, you were the star, and we wanted to hear from you. And I want to tell you, McCracken, this has been better than wonderful. This has been fantastic. We've enjoyed. We want you to write another book, and we want to get you back. And I want to tell all of our viewers and listeners out there, go buy this book. McCracken Poston Jr. Get the right one and buy this book and read it, because it is a tale. You've just heard part of it. There's so much more to it, and it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful story. So McCracken, thank you so much. Katherine, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching. Be sure to hit that thumbs up and that you like this, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can see more of this. And we'll be back with more shows. This has been Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction, on the Outliers YouTube channel. So until next time, keep reading, keep writing, and keep having fun. Try to stay out of trouble, though I know that's almost impossible.